The mining base sprawled across the barren plateau like a metallic infection on the planet's surface. Massive extractors tore into the crystalline deposits while automated defense turrets swept the perimeter with deadly precision. From their concealed position in the rocky highlands, Jake studied the installation through binoculars while Shadow's breathing created small clouds in the thin mountain air. 27 defensive positions, Jake murmured, marking targets on his tactical pad. Motion sensors every 50 meters, and those turrets pack enough firepower to level a city block. Shadow made a questioning sound, and Jake showed him the display. The alien Leopard studied the layout with obvious intelligence, then indicated several blind spots that Jake had missed. Good eye, Jake acknowledged. If we can reach that maintenance shaft, I should be able to access their central computer. The plan was dangerous but simple. Shadow would lead a diversionary attack on the base's eastern perimeter, drawing the automated defenses away from Jake's infiltration route. Once inside, Jake would disable the security systems and open the way for the Kithara to reclaim their territory. What they hadn't expected was to find other prisoners. Jake discovered them in the base's detention center, 3 Kithara in energy cage cells, their magnificent forms reduced to shadows of their former selves. But it was the female in the center cell that made Jake's heart race. Even weakened by captivity, she was unmistakably related to Shadow. The same midnight fur with shifting patterns, the same intelligent eyes, though hers burned with fury rather than gentle curiosity. Star Whisper, Jake whispered, recognizing Shadow's mate from the descriptions he'd heard. The female Kithara's head snapped toward him, and she let out a sound that was part challenge, part desperate hope. She had expected another human captor, not a rescue. Jake was working on the cell locks when the base's alarm systems shrieked to life. Through the detention center's windows, he could see weapons fire lighting up the eastern perimeter as Shadow and his team began their assault. Come on, Jake muttered, his fingers flying over the control panel. The lock mechanisms were more complex than he'd anticipated, and precious seconds were ticking away. Finally, the energy cages deactivated. Star Whisper bounded out immediately, moving despite her obvious weakness to check on her fellow prisoners. The other 2 Kithara were barely conscious but alive. Through urgent gestures and the few Kithara words he'd learned, Jake tried to explain that Shadow was here, that this was a rescue mission. Star Whisper's reaction was explosive, a sound of pure joy that seemed to shake the building's foundations. But their escape route was already compromised. Security forces were converging on their position, and Jake could hear the heavy footsteps of combat mechs in the corridors outside. That's when Star Whisper proved why she had led the resistance against the miners. The female Kithara moved with deadly grace. Her weakened state forgotten in the heat of battle, she flowed through the security teams like liquid shadow, her claws finding weak points in their armor with surgical precision. Jake had seen Shadow fight, but Star Whisper was something else entirely. A warrior born and bred for conflict. Together, they fought their way toward the base's central computer core. Jake provided technical support, hacking security doors and disabling automated defenses, while Star Whisper carved a path through any opposition that stood in their way. The computer core was a massive chamber filled with humming processors and data storage units. Jake immediately began uploading the virus he'd prepared, a program designed to shut down not just this base, but the entire mining operation across the planet. 5 minutes, Jake announced, watching the upload progress. Then we need to be gone. Star Whisper positioned herself at the chamber entrance, ready to defend their position. Her low growls echoed off the metal walls as security forces gathered in the corridor outside. The attack, when it came, was overwhelming. Combat mechs stormed the chamber while human soldiers provided covering fire. Jake dove behind a computer bank as energy bolts seared the air where he'd been standing. But the miners had made a critical error in their tactics. They had planned for human infiltrators and Kithara assault teams, but they hadn't planned for cooperation between the 2 species. Jake's technical skills complemented Star Whisper's combat abilities perfectly. While she engaged the mechs in close combat, Jake hacked their control systems, turning their own weapons against them. When soldiers tried to flank her position, Jake triggered security doors to cut off their advance. The tide turned when Shadow arrived. The male Kithara's roar shook the entire base as he fought his way to the computer core. When he finally reached the chamber and saw his mate alive and fighting, the sound he made was indescribable, Joy and fury and love all mixed into something that needed no translation. Shadow and Star Whisper fought side by side with a coordination that spoke of years of partnership. They moved like two parts of the same being, anticipating each other's actions and covering each other's weaknesses. Jake's virus finally completed its upload just as the base's main reactor began to overload. The mining operation's own automated systems, now under Jake's control, were systematically destroying the facility from within. "Time to go," Jake shouted over the alarms. The retreat was harrowing but successful. Shadow and Star Whisper between them carried the weakened prisoners while Jake guided them through evacuation routes he'd memorized from the base schematics. Behind them, the mining facility tore itself apart as Jake's virus spread through its systems. They reached the pickup point just as Captain Voss's shuttle arrived. The alien pilot took one look at the smoke and flames rising from the plateau and shook his head in amazement. "I've seen human stubbornness before," Voss told Jake as they lifted off. "But this is remarkable even by your species standards." Jake was too busy watching Shadow and Star Whisper's reunion to respond. The two Kythera were engaged in a complex display of affection that involved intertwined necks, soft sounds, and gentle grooming. It was clearly a private moment, but Jake couldn't help smiling at the sight of his partner's happiness. As they flew back toward the Crystal City, Jake's tactical display showed similar destructions occurring across the planet. His virus had worked perfectly, shutting down every mining operation simultaneously. The automated systems that the miners had relied on for security had become the instruments of their own defeat. Star Whisper approached Jake during the flight, moving with careful dignity despite her ordeal. Through gestures and expressions, she communicated something that needed no translation, gratitude that went beyond words. When Shadow joined them, positioning himself between Jake and his mate in a gesture that clearly meant introduction and acceptance, Jake felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the shuttle's heating systems. "You're welcome," Jake said simply, and both Kythera made sounds that he had learned meant family. Below them, the Crystal City grew larger as they approached, and Jake could see hundreds of Kythera gathering to welcome back their heroes. The war against the miners was over, but Jake sensed that his real adventure with Shadow and his people was just beginning. As the shuttle settled onto the landing platform, Jake realized something had fundamentally changed. He was no longer just Shadow's human partner. He had become part of something larger, something that transcended species boundaries. He had become part of the family, and for the first time in his life, Jake Morrison truly knew what home meant. Shadow's homeworld was even more beautiful than Jake had imagined. From orbit, Kytheros looked like a jewel. Vast oceans the color of liquid sapphire, continents covered in crystalline forests that caught and reflected the light of its twin suns. The planet's rings cast dancing shadows across the surface, creating patterns that shifted like living art. But as their shuttle descended through the atmosphere, Jake began to notice troubling details. Vast sections of the crystal forest showed signs of recent destruction, blackened craters where mining equipment had torn through the landscape, leaving wounds that would take centuries to heal. Shadow grew increasingly agitated as they flew over his home territory. The alien Leopard's usual calm demeanor cracked as he saw the devastation below, and he began making sounds of distress that needed no translation. "Easy, Shadow," Jake murmured, placing a comforting hand on his partner's flank. "We'll figure this out." Captain Voss piloted the shuttle toward what their sensors indicated was the largest concentration of Kythera life signs. As they crested a mountain ridge, they finally saw Shadow's people in their natural habitat. The sight took Jake's breath away. A vast crystal city spread across the valley below, its spires and archways growing from the living rock like frozen music. Kythera moved through the structures with fluid grace, their dark forms flowing between buildings that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. But even here, the signs of recent conflict were evident. Several of the crystal spires had been shattered, their broken remains scattered across the valley floor, and the number of Kythera Jake could see was disturbingly small for such a large settlement. Shadow's cries grew more urgent as they landed, and before Jake could stop him, the alien Leopard bounded from the shuttle the moment the ramp lowered. Jake hurried after him, calling his name, but Shadow was already racing toward the Crystal City with desperate purpose. The effect of Shadow's arrival was immediate and dramatic. Kythera emerged from the crystal structures, their calls echoing across the valley as they recognized one of their own. But Jake noticed something troubling. Many of them bore scars, and several showed signs of recent injuries. Shadow reached the center of the settlement and let out a long, complex call that seemed to contain every emotion he'd held in check during their long journey. The response was overwhelming as dozens of Kythera surrounded him, their sounds of welcome and grief mixing into a symphony that brought tears to Jake's eyes. Through Lyra's translation, Jake learned the devastating truth. In the year since Shadow's capture, his people had suffered terribly. The illegal mining operations had escalated into open warfare when the Kythera had tried to defend their territory. Shadow's mate, Star Whisper, had led several raids against the miners, but she had disappeared 3 months ago during an attack on their main installation. Shadow's cubs, too young. Kythera, who should have been learning to hunt under their father's guidance, had been lost in the fighting. Jake watched his partner receive this news, and his heart broke at the sight of Shadow's anguish. The mighty alien Leopard collapsed among his people, his cries of grief echoing off the crystal walls. But Shadow's people weren't just grieving, they were angry. As the initial reunion settled, Jake found himself surrounded by Kythera who made it clear that they held all humans responsible for their losses. Their body language was unmistakably hostile, and Jake realized that his presence here might have made things worse for everyone. It was Shadow who saved him. Despite his own grief, Shadow positioned himself between Jake and the increasingly aggressive Kythera. The alien Leopard's message was clear. This human was under his protection, and any threat to Jake would have to go through him first. The confrontation that followed was tense and complex. Through Lyra's translation, Jake learned that Shadow's people couldn't understand how he could ally himself with a member of the species that had brought such devastation to their world. Shadow's response surprised everyone, including Jake. The alien Leopard told his people the complete story of their partnership, how Jake had found him dying and starving, how the human had risked his own safety to provide food and medical care, how they had fought together against the pirates. But more than that, Shadow explained what Jake represented. Proof that not all humans were enemies, that cooperation between species was possible. The debate raged for hours, with Jake sitting quietly while the Kythera argued among themselves. Finally, an ancient female who seemed to be some kind of leader approached Jake directly. Through Lyra, she told him, "Shadow Sun speaks of your deeds, human Jake, but words are wind. If you truly wish to help our people, prove it with actions. Tell me what you need," Jake replied without hesitation. The challenge was daunting. The miners had established a heavily fortified base in the planet's northern continent, and they were using automated defense systems to protect their operations. The Kythera's natural abilities made them formidable hunters, but they lacked the technical knowledge to overcome human technology. Jake, however, understood human tech better than anyone. "I can disable their defenses," Jake said, studying the tactical displays the Kythera had prepared. "But I'll need Shadow's help to get close enough." The plan they developed was audacious and dangerous. Jake would infiltrate the mining base using his knowledge of human systems, while Shadow and a team of Kythera warriors provided distraction and support. If they succeeded, they could shut down the mining operation permanently and maybe find clues about what had happened to Shadow's mate. The night before the mission, Jake sat with Shadow on a crystal outcropping overlooking the valley. The alien Leopard had been quiet since learning of his family's fate, and Jake could feel the weight of his partner's sorrow. "You don't have to do this," Jake said quietly. "You've been through enough." Shadow's response was immediate and firm. Through a combination of sounds and gestures that Jake had learned to interpret, his partner made it clear that this was exactly what he needed to do, not just for revenge but to honor the memory of his lost family and protect what remained of his people. "Then we do it together," Jake said, reaching out to scratch behind Shadow's ears in the gesture of affection that had become natural between them. Shadow's answering rumble was filled with determination and gratitude, and Jake knew that whatever the next day might bring, they would face it as they had faced everything else, as partners, as friends, as family. As the twin suns set behind the crystal mountains, casting rainbow patterns across the valley, Jake felt a sense of purpose he'd never experienced before. He'd come to this world to help Shadow find his family, but somewhere along the way he'd found his own. Tomorrow they would risk everything to strike back at the forces that had torn Shadow's world apart. But tonight they were home, surrounded by Shadow's people, and ready to fight for something bigger than either of them alone. The stars came out one by one, and Jake made a silent promise to the cosmos. By the time this was over, Shadow's people would have their freedom, and maybe, just maybe, they would have some answers about what had happened to Star Whisper. In the distance, a young Kithara called out in the night, and Shadow answered with a sound that Jake had learned meant hope. The trading station Nexus Prime buzzed with activity from dozens of different species. Jake had never seen so many aliens in one place, and the sight made him acutely aware of how unusual his partnership with Shadow truly was. They'd been docked for 3 days, and Jake was beginning to understand the challenges they faced. Many species found humans unsettling, but the sight of a human traveling with a Kithara caused reactions ranging from amazement to outright fear. "Stay close," Jake murmured to Shadow as they made their way through the station's main concourse. "Some of these folks looked nervous." Shadow's response was a subtle shift in posture that somehow made him appear less threatening, while maintaining his natural dignity. The alien Leopard had a remarkable ability to read social situations and adjust accordingly. They were heading toward the parts dealer when a commotion erupted near the docking bay. A group of Xanthari traders, tall, blue-skinned humanoids known for their aggressive business practices, had surrounded a smaller being that Jake couldn't clearly see through the crowd. "Not our problem," Jake told himself. But Shadow had already started moving toward the disturbance. "Shadow, wait," Jake called, hurrying after his massive companion. The crowd parted as Shadow approached, and Jake saw what had caused the commotion. A young alien, one of the peaceful bird-like species from the outer rim, cowered on the ground while the Xanthari loomed over her. "The debt must be paid," the lead Xanthari was saying. "Your family's shipping company failed to deliver our cargo. Someone must answer for the loss." The young alien, barely more than a child by her species standards, looked up with terrified eyes. "Please, I told you I don't know anything about my father's business. I'm just trying to get home." "Ignorance is not an excuse," the Xanthari replied, reaching for the small being. That's when Shadow stepped forward. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The massive Kithara placed himself between the Xanthari and the young alien, and his presence transformed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. Shadow didn't growl or show aggression. He simply stood there, radiating calm menace. The lead Xanthari's hand froze in mid-reach. "This is none of your concern, beast." Shadow's ears flattened slightly, and Jake recognized the warning sign. He quickly stepped up beside his partner. "Actually, it is our concern," Jake said calmly. "We don't like seeing children threatened." "This is a matter of business law," the Xanthari protested. But Jake could see uncertainty in his eyes. No one wanted to face an angry Kithara. "Then let's discuss it like civilized beings," Jake suggested. "What was the cargo? What was it worth?" After some negotiation, and with Shadow's imposing presence ensuring everyone remained civil, they worked out a solution. The young alien's family had indeed failed to deliver a shipment of rare crystals, but the loss was due to pirate attacks, not negligence. Jake offered to help locate replacement crystals at a fair price, and the Xanthari agreed to accept payment rather than pursuing their vendetta. As the traders dispersed, the young alien approached Jake and Shadow hesitantly. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the station's ambient noise. "I thought they were going to... I was so scared." Shadow lowered his great head to the alien's level and made a soft, reassuring sound. The young being tentatively reached out to touch his fur, her fear melting away as she encountered only gentleness. "What's your name?" Jake asked. "Lyra," she replied, still stroking Shadow's fur with wonder. "I've never seen a Kithara before. The stories make them sound so fierce." "Shadow can be fierce when he needs to be," Jake said, "but he's also the gentlest being I've ever met." Over the following days, Lyra became a frequent visitor to their docking bay. She was stranded on the station, waiting for her family to send passage money, and had nowhere else to go. Jake found himself looking forward to her visits, and Shadow seemed to enjoy having someone new to communicate with. The young alien had a gift for languages, and quickly learned to interpret Shadow's various sounds and gestures. Through her translation, Jake discovered that Shadow had been trying to tell him complex things for weeks. He says the mining station reminded him of his home, Lyra explained after a long conversation with Shadow. The metal structures looked like the crystal formations where his people build their nests. Nests? Jake asked, surprised. His species isn't solitary like we thought, Lyra continued. They live in family groups, and Shadow had a mate and cubs when he was captured. Jake felt his heart clench. All this time, Shadow hadn't just been homesick. He'd been separated from his family. He doesn't know if they're still alive, Lyra added softly. It's been over a year since he was taken. That night, Jake sat in his ship's cramped living space, staring at the star charts that showed the route to Shadow's homeworld. The fuel costs alone would bankrupt him, but looking at his partner's hopeful expression, Jake knew he had to find a way. I'm going to get you home, Jake promised. Whatever it takes. Shadow's response was a gentle nuzzle against Jake's shoulder, followed by a series of complex sounds that Lyra had taught. Jake meant gratitude and affection. The breakthrough came when Lyra mentioned that her family's shipping company specialized in long-range cargo runs to unexplored systems. When her father finally arrived to collect her, Jake seized the opportunity. Captain Voss was a distinguished alien with silver-tipped feathers and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He listened carefully as Jake explained their situation, occasionally glancing at Shadow with obvious interest. A human traveling with a Cathera, Voss mused. I've lived for 2 centuries and never seen such a thing. Shadow saved my life, Jake said simply. Now I want to help him find his family. Voss studied the star charts Jake had prepared. The route is dangerous. That region of space has been unstable since the war. We'll manage, Jake replied. Perhaps, Voss said slowly. We can help each other. My company has been contracted to establish trade relations with several species in that sector. Having a Cathera as a cultural liaison would be invaluable. Jake looked at Shadow, who seemed to understand the conversation despite the language barrier. The alien Leopard made a questioning sound. He's offering us passage in exchange for Shadow's help with negotiations, Jake explained. Shadow's response was immediate and enthusiastic. He bounded over to Voss and very carefully offered his paw in what Jake had learned was a Cathera gesture of agreement. Voss, to his credit, shook the massive paw solemnly. Then we have a deal. 2 days later, Jake stood on the bridge of the alien ship Star Whisper, watching the stars wheel past as they jumped toward Shadow's home system. Shadow sat beside him, radiating contentment and anticipation. Nervous? Jake asked. Shadow made a sound that Lyra had identified as the Cathera equivalent of yes and no. Jake understood completely. After more than a year of separation, Shadow was finally going home. But there was no guarantee of what they would find there. As they emerged from hyperspace near a blue-green world that took Jake's breath away, Shadow let out a sound unlike anything Jake had ever heard from him. A cry that was part joy, part anguish, and entirely alien. Welcome home, partner, Jake whispered. And Shadow's gentle rumble told him that whatever they found on the surface below, they would face it together. The adventure was far from over, but for the first time since leaving the mining station, Jake felt like they were exactly where they needed to be. 3 weeks after finding Shadow, Jake had transformed the abandoned mining station into something resembling a home. He'd rigged the hydroponics bay to grow earth vegetables alongside some edible fungi he'd found in the station's database. Shadow had learned to operate several of the simpler computer interfaces and had even figured out how to adjust the environmental controls to his liking. The alien Leopard's injuries had healed remarkably well, and his strength was returning daily. Jake had initially worried about what would happen when Shadow regained his full power, but those fears had proven groundless. If anything, Shadow had become more gentle and considerate as he recovered. The morning everything changed started like any other. Jake was reviewing shipping manifests on his salvage computer, looking for potential jobs that might pay well enough to fund their eventual journey to Shadow's homeworld. Shadow lay nearby, methodically grooming his midnight fur with a tongue that could probably strip paint. The proximity alarm shrieked suddenly, echoing through the station corridors. Jake rushed to the sensor station, Shadow padding silently behind him. On the screen, 3 ships approached in tight formation. Sleek, predatory vessels that Jake recognized with a sinking heart. Pirates. This is not good, Jake muttered, frantically trying to calculate how long they had before the ships arrived. Shadow studied the display with obvious intelligence. then made a series of complex sounds that somehow conveyed urgency and concern. "Yeah, I know," Jake replied. "These guys aren't going to be interested in negotiation." The lead ship hailed the station, and Jake reluctantly opened the channel. A scarred human face appeared on screen, grinning with malicious anticipation. "Well, well, looks like this old mining station isn't as abandoned as we thought," the pirate captain said. "This is Captain Vega of the Bloodwing. You've got exactly 5 minutes to transfer all your credits and cargo to our ship, or we start shooting." Jake looked at his meager possessions, then at Shadow, who was watching the exchange with growing tension. "I don't have much," Jake said honestly. "Just a salvage ship and some personal gear." Vega's grin widened. "Then you better hope your ship has enough parts to make this worth our time." 4 minutes, 30 seconds. The transmission cut off, leaving Jake staring at the blank screen. He could surrender his ship and hope the pirates left him alive, but that would strand both him and Shadow indefinitely. Or he could run, but his old salvage vessel wouldn't outrun the pirate ships. Shadow made a questioning sound, and Jake turned to find the alien Leopard watching him intently. "I'm thinking," Jake said. "There's got to be a way out of this." Suddenly, Shadow bounded toward the communication console and began operating the controls with practiced ease. The screen lit up with a schematic of the mining station, and Shadow began indicating various sections with his claws. "What are you—" Jake began. Then understanding dawned. "You're showing me the station's defensive systems." Shadow chirped affirmatively and highlighted the mining lasers that had been used to cut through asteroids. They were powerful enough to damage ships if they could be repositioned and properly targeted. "That's brilliant," Jake breathed. "But I'd need someone to operate the targeting computers while I handle the power routing." Shadow looked at him meaningfully, then moved to the targeting station and began familiarizing himself with the controls. "You sure about this?" Jake asked. "These are dangerous people. They'll kill us both if we fight back." Shadow's response was a low, rumbling growl that made Jake's hair stand on end. For the first time since they'd met, he was reminded that his gentle companion was still very much an apex predator. They worked frantically to prepare their desperate plan. Jake rerouted power from non-essential systems, while Shadow proved remarkably adept at understanding the targeting interface. His spatial reasoning was actually superior to most humans, allowing him to calculate intercept vectors with startling accuracy. 2 minutes, Jake announced, sweat beading on his forehead as he finished the power routing. Shadow had taken position at the targeting console, his massive paws surprisingly deft on the controls. The alien Leopard's usual gentle demeanor had been replaced by focused intensity that reminded Jake why Shadow's species was the apex predator of their world. "Incoming. Transmission," the computer announced. "Captain." Vega appeared on screen again, no longer grinning. "Time's up, Salvager. Prepare to be boarded." "Actually," Jake said, trying to keep his voice steady, "I've got a counteroffer." Vega laughed. "You're in no position to negotiate." "Maybe not," Jake replied. "But my friend here disagrees." The camera shifted to show Shadow at the targeting console, and Vega's laughter died abruptly. "What the hell is that thing?" "Kythera," Jake said simply. "You might know them as the species that wiped out the Centauri pirate fleets last year." It was a bluff. Jake had no idea if Shadow's species had been involved in any fleet actions, but Vega's face went pale. "That's impossible. Kythera don't work with humans." "This one does," Jake said, "and he's really, really good at targeting systems." As if to prove the point, Shadow locked onto the lead pirate ship and activated the mining laser. The beam lanced out across space, striking the ship's engine section with surgical precision. The vessel lurched as its main drive went offline. "What do you want?" Vega demanded, his earlier confidence evaporated. "Safe passage," Jake said. "We leave, you forget you ever saw us, and nobody else gets hurt." Shadow's claws moved across the targeting controls, and the laser swiveled to track the second pirate ship. The message was clear. "Done," Vega said quickly. "We'll escort you out of the system. No tricks." 20 minutes later, Jake's salvage ship undocked from the mining station with Shadow squeezed into the co-pilot's seat. The alien Leopard's size made the cramped cockpit even more crowded, but he seemed fascinated by the ship's controls. True to their word, the pirates maintained a respectful distance as Jake's ship limped toward the system's edge. Only when they jumped to hyperspace did Jake allow himself to relax. "We did it," he said, grinning at Shadow. "We actually did it." Shadow's response was a sound Jake had never heard before. something that might have been laughter in a different species. The alien leopard gently bumped Jake's shoulder with his massive head, a gesture of affection and gratitude. As they flew through hyperspace toward an uncertain destination, Jake realized their relationship had fundamentally changed. They were no longer human and alien or rescuer and rescued. They were partners, equals who had faced danger together and emerged victorious. "So," Jake said, studying the star charts on his navigation display. "Where to next, partner?" Shadow leaned over the display, studying their options with obvious intelligence. After a moment, he indicated a system known for its trading stations and diverse population. "Good choice," Jake agreed. "We can resupply there and figure out our next move." As their ship hurtled through the void between stars, Jake couldn't help but smile. He'd started this journey as a desperate salvage operator, but somehow he'd gained something infinitely more valuable than credits or cargo. He'd gained a friend who would stand by him against any odds, and together they could face whatever challenges the galaxy might throw at them. Shadow's gentle rumbling filled the cockpit, and Jake knew that whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. Jake woke to the sound of grinding metal. In the dim emergency lighting of the hydroponics bay, he watched the alien leopard methodically chewing on a piece of twisted steel piping, its powerful jaws reducing the metal to manageable fragments. "Well, that explains the claw marks on the doors," Jake muttered, stretching muscles stiff from sleeping against the wall. The creature's head snapped toward him at the sound of his voice, and Jake was relieved to see alertness in those strange eyes where yesterday there had been only exhaustion. The preserved meat and nutrient paste had clearly helped, though the alien leopard still looked gaunt. Jake slowly reached for his remaining supplies. "Hungry again, big guy?" The creature's ears perked forward, and it abandoned the metal piping to focus entirely on Jake. This time, when Jake offered food, the alien leopard approached without hesitation, though it still moved with careful deliberation. As the creature ate, Jake noticed something interesting. It was making soft sounds, not quite purring but a low rhythmic rumble that seemed to indicate contentment. The sound was oddly soothing. "You know, I should probably figure out what to call you," Jake said. "Can't keep thinking of you as the creature forever." The alien leopard paused in its eating to look at him, head tilted as if considering his words. "How about Shadow? You've got that whole shifting pattern thing going on." Jake gestured at the creature's fur, which did indeed seem to ripple and change in the flickering light. Shadow, Jake decided the name fit, made a sound that was almost like a chirp. Whether it was approval or just coincidence, Jake chose to take it as agreement. After Shadow finished eating, Jake decided to explore the station more thoroughly. He needed to understand what had happened here and maybe find more food sources for his unexpected companion. "I'm going to look around," Jake announced, standing up. "You should probably rest that leg." Shadow struggled to its feet as well, clearly intending to follow. "Whoa, easy there." Jake held up his hands. "You're hurt. Stay here and recover." Shadow sat back on its haunches but let out a series of sounds that Jake could only describe as argumentative. The alien's intelligence was becoming more apparent by the hour. "Fine," Jake sighed, "but take it slow." They made an odd pair moving through the station corridors, the human salvage operator and the massive alien predator. Shadow limped along behind Jake, occasionally stopping to sniff at something interesting or to examine the claw marks that scored various surfaces throughout the facility. In the miners' quarters, Jake found personal logs and discovered the truth about what had happened. The mining team had been illegally harvesting rare crystals from a protected alien world. Shadow's species, the logs called them Kythera, were the planet's apex predators and apparently quite protective of their territory. The miners had captured Shadow as a juvenile, planning to sell it to off-world collectors, but they'd underestimated both its intelligence and its growth rate. Within months, Shadow had grown too large and dangerous for their makeshift containment systems. The final log entry, recorded 3 months ago, told the rest of the story. Shadow had escaped and systematically hunted down every human on the station. The miners had fled in the night, leaving their captive behind with no way to return home and no proper food source. Jake looked back at Shadow, who was carefully examining a child's toy left behind by one of the miner families. The creature's touch was surprisingly gentle as it turned the small object over with one massive paw. They kidnapped you, Jake said quietly. You were just trying to get home. Shadow looked up at him, and Jake swore he saw understanding in those alien eyes. In the station's medical bay, Jake found supplies he could use to treat Shadow's injuries. The creature submitted to his ministrations with remarkable patience, only flinching when Jake cleaned the worst of the wounds. You know I'm trying to help, don't you? Jake asked as he applied antibiotic gel to a particularly nasty gash. Shadow's response was that same soft rumbling sound, and this time, Jake was certain it indicated trust. The breakthrough came when they reached the station's communication center. Jake was examining the long-range transmitter when Shadow suddenly became agitated, making urgent chittering sounds and pawing at one of the control panels. What is it, boy? Jake asked, then felt foolish for treating the obviously intelligent creature like a pet. Shadow manipulated the controls with surprising dexterity, and suddenly the main screen lit up with a star chart. The alien Leopard touched the screen with one claw tip, indicating a system several parsecs away. That's your home? Jake asked. Shadow made that affirming chirp again, then looked at Jake with an expression that was unmistakably hopeful. Jake's heart sank. His salvage ship could make short-range jumps, but a journey of several parsecs would require resources he simply didn't have. The fuel alone would cost more than his ship was worth, but looking at Shadow's eager expression, Jake made a decision that surprised even him. I can't get you there right away, he said slowly, but maybe we can figure something out together. Shadow seemed to understand that it wouldn't be immediate, but the hope remained in its eyes. The creature approached Jake and very carefully rested its massive head against the human's shoulder. It was a gesture of trust that took Jake's breath away. All right, Shadow, Jake said, reaching up to gently scratch behind one of the creature's ears. Looks like you're stuck with me for a while. But I promise you this. I won't abandon you like they did. Shadow's rumbling purr filled the communication center, and Jake realized that somewhere in the past day, everything had changed. He'd come here looking for salvage, but instead he'd found something much more valuable, a connection that transcended species barriers. As they settled in for their second night together, Jake began planning. Getting Shadow home would be expensive and dangerous, but humans had a reputation in the galaxy for doing impossible things when they set their minds to it. Besides, Jake thought as Shadow curled up nearby, close enough to protect but far enough away to give the human space, he'd never had a partner he trusted more. The alien Leopard's gentle breathing eventually lulled Jake to sleep, and his dreams were filled with star charts and the possibility of adventure among distant worlds. The mining station on Kepler 442b had been dead for 3 months when Jake Morrison's salvage ship detected the faint distress beacon. Most scavengers would have ignored such an old signal, but Jake needed the credits badly enough to risk whatever had killed an entire mining operation. The airlock hissed as Jake stepped onto the station, his boots echoing through empty corridors. Emergency lighting cast eerie red shadows across the walls, and the air recyclers hummed with an unhealthy grinding sound. He'd seen plenty of abandoned stations, but this one felt different, too quiet, too still. Jake made his way toward the main computer core, scanning for valuable salvage along the way. The miners had left in a hurry, personal belongings scattered across the floor, meals half-eaten on tables, workstations still logged in. Whatever had happened here, it had been sudden. A low growl echoed from somewhere deeper in the station. Jake froze, his hand moving instinctively to the plasma cutter on his belt. Mining stations didn't have wildlife. The growl came again, closer this time, followed by the sound of claws scraping against metal. Moving carefully, Jake followed the sound toward the station's hydroponics bay. The doors had been torn apart, massive gouges in the reinforced steel revealing something had forced its way through. Inside, the growing chambers lay in ruins. Soil scattered across the floor, plants withered and dead. In the center of the destruction, curled against the far wall, was the most magnificent and terrifying creature Jake had ever seen. It resembled a leopard, but scaled up to the size of a small vehicle. Its fur was midnight black with patterns that seemed to shift and shimmer in the emergency lighting. 6 legs ended in claws that could easily slice through steel, and its head was broader than a human torso, equipped with fangs that gleamed like ivory daggers. The creature was clearly dying. Its ribs showed through patchy fur, and its breathing came in labored gasps. One of its rear legs bent at an unnatural angle, and dried blood matted the fur around several wounds. When it noticed Jake, it lifted its massive head and let out a weak snarl, but even that small effort seemed to exhaust it. Jake should have left. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to get back to his ship and forget he'd ever seen this place. Instead, he found himself stepping closer. The creature's eyes were the most human thing about it, intelligent, desperate, and filled with a pain that went beyond physical suffering. They were the eyes of something that had given up hope. "Easy there, big guy," Jake whispered, raising his hand slowly. "I'm not here to hurt you." The alien leopard watched him with those impossibly expressive eyes. Its ears, pointed and mobile like a cat's, twitched at the sound of his voice. For a moment, predator and human regarded each other across the ruined hydroponics bay. Jake noticed the creature's gaze kept drifting toward the destroyed growing chambers. Following its line of sight, he spotted something that made his heart clench. The withered remains of what looked like fruit-bearing plants, the kind miners used to supplement their rations. The creature wasn't just injured, it was starving. "You've been trying to eat the plants, haven't you?" Jake asked softly. The alien leopard's ears drooped, and it let out a sound that was almost like a whimper. Jake's mind raced. He had emergency rations back on his ship, protein bars, nutrient paste, even some preserved meat. But would human food be safe for an alien metabolism? Would the creature even trust him enough to accept help? More importantly, why was he even considering this? The smart thing would be to leave the creature to die and continue with his salvage operation. But looking into those eyes, Jake couldn't bring himself to walk away. He backed toward the exit, moving slowly to avoid startling the creature. "I'll be right back," he said, not sure if it could understand his words, but hoping his tone would convey his intentions. The alien leopard watched him go, its head resting wearily on its front paws. Jake ran back to his ship, his mind churning with questions. How had this creature ended up on a human mining station? What had happened to the miners? And why did he feel compelled to help something that could easily kill him the moment it regained its strength? He grabbed his emergency food supplies and a first aid kit, then paused at his weapon locker. After a moment's hesitation, he left the guns behind. If the creature wanted him dead, a pistol wouldn't make much difference anyway. When Jake returned to the hydroponics bay, the alien leopard was exactly where he'd left it. Though its breathing seemed even more labored, he approached slowly, setting the supplies down just within the creature's reach. "I don't know if you can eat this stuff," Jake said, opening a package of preserved meat. The smell filled the air and the creature's nostrils flared. Its eyes fixed on the food with desperate hunger. Jake tossed a piece of meat toward the alien leopard. It sniffed cautiously, then devoured the morsel in one quick gulp. When nothing bad happened, Jake threw another piece, this one landing closer to himself. The creature struggled to its feet, favoring its injured leg, and limped forward to claim the food. It was even more massive standing up. Its shoulder would reach Jake's chest, and its paws were larger than dinner plates. But despite its size and obvious power, it moved with careful deliberation, never approaching too quickly or making any threatening gestures. When it finished eating, it settled back down, but closer to Jake this time. "You're not just a mindless beast, are you?" Jake murmured, studying the creature's intelligent eyes. "Something tells me there's a lot more to your story." The alien leopard tilted its great head almost as if it understood. Then it closed its eyes and, for the first time since Jake had found it, seemed to relax. Jake settled against the opposite wall, keeping the remaining food within easy reach. He had no idea what he was getting himself into. But one thing was certain. He wasn't leaving this creature to die alone in the dark. Outside the station, the twin suns of the Kepler system set behind the planet's horizon, and the first day of an unlikely partnership came to an end.